We are living through the worst economy that almost anybody alive has ever seen.
The market, as it always does, has divided itself into two camps. There are those who are optimistic about controlling the pandemic and reviving growth, and there are those who aren't. Which camp do you fall into?
I think the real divide, Eric, is the ones who think it'll come easily and quickly, and the ones who think it'll come slowly and haltingly. And I'm in the latter category in that regard. I don't see a immediate V-shaped recovery, and people are talking about the possible recovery using different letters, V, U, W. My partner, Bruce Karsh, talks about an L-shaped recovery. Some people talk about the Nike swoosh. I think that we won't have a continuous uplift of good news. We'll have good news lift mixed with bad news. We'll have a vaccine, but it won't come this year, and it won't come to everybody immediately. You know, we need 7 billion doses for the whole world, and it's going to take a long time to manufacture those and roll them out. I think that the Fed has great power, but not forever. And I think that, first of all, I don't think it really, Jay Powell talked about the Fed will not have the ability to run out of ammunition. I don't know if the Fed's ammunition is really limitless. I know that the Fed can cause markets to rise and stay up as long as it buys, but I don't know if it can buy forever. We're in new territory here. Historically, the Fed has never bought corporate securities. This time around, they included corporate securities, and then they moved on to include non-investment grade corporate securities. Its buying can make these things rise, but only as long as it's buying. I think of it as kind of, we've seen these things where there's kind of a column of water and then a ball sitting on top of the water. And as long as the water's forced up, the ball stays there. Water stops, ball falls down to earth. So obviously the Fed hopes that its buying will, among other things, inject confidence into people and that they'll take over in buying. But that remains to be seen, and it remains to be seen whether that buying will be at today's levels. This is not a cycle. This is an episode. Not everything that goes on in the world is part of a cycle. There are exogenous, idiosyncratic events as well. So, a cycle, and of course you're trying to plug my book, Mastering the Market Cycle, and I greatly appreciate that. But a cycle is kind of a regular pattern of ups and downs. There's a trend line, let's say GDP. The trend line of GDP in the US grows at 2% a year, but sometimes faster and sometimes slower, and sometimes it shrinks in recession. So there are excesses and corrections and excesses and corrections, fluctuations. This occurs throughout history. It occurs in economies, in companies, in psyches, in civilizations, in many things. Regular, not in the sense of being consistent in length and amplitude, or even reasons or impact, but regular in the fact that it tends to happen over time. This is not that. This is a meteor hitting the earth for reasons not having to do with excesses or corrections or people's activities. This is what we call an exogenous impact, and it hit the earth and it changed life as we know it for the last 3 months. And it had economic impact, but the nothing that's going on came from within the system, within the economy, within the companies, et cetera. And so this is not subject to cyclical analysis. Now, we think there'll be a recovery.
We could talk about this as being an igniting event, even if it's a meteor in its scale, and conflagrating power. And then some things are supposed to happen, right? Companies are supposed to be locked out of first of all, corporate profits collapse, and that's happened. Companies are supposed to be locked out of the credit market. There's supposed to be defaults, there's supposed to be bankruptcies, and then risk capital is supposed to come in at the right price, seeking outsized returns, and help the economy to recover. That's what I'm getting at. Is that going to happen this time? Some of those things seem to have occurred, but we've also talked about things that appear to be different this time, like, for example, the Fed's participation in the corporate credit market.
Yes, there are things missing. First of all, you talked about the credit window closing. I forget what your words were, but that's the common terminology. You get when we get a recession and we get an adverse reaction in the markets, we get a rising fear factor, or you might say increasing risk aversion, and the credit window slams shut. And whereas 3 or 6 months ago, anybody could borrow any amount of money for any reason or no reason, now nobody can get any money. And people who need money default, go bankrupt, et cetera. And there's a cleansing out of the weak from the market, and the strong come back. But this time, in order to minimize damage, well, minimize sounds like a ridiculous word in this context, to limit the damage to the economy, the Fed and the Treasury sprung into action, not in months as they did in the global financial crisis, but in weeks, and started to inject large amounts of money into the economy and into the markets. And so that has limited the extent of the credit crunch. There are still companies that are desperate for money in order to avoid default, and some that the Fed and Treasury actions are not reaching, which will have problems. And the rating agencies and the investment banks are predicting that somewhere between 15 and 25% of all the high yield bond issuers, for example, will default in this cycle. So the Fed has not eliminated the negative impact, but it has limited it. We are living through the worst economy that almost anybody alive has ever seen. You have to be over 80 years old to go back to the 30s to have seen worse, and maybe we're even worse than that. It's believed that the unemployment rate will hit a higher level than was achieved in the Great Depression. People are talking about second quarter GDP being down 30 to 40%. As far as we know, I mean, there aren't good quarterly records, but as far as we know, there's never been a quarterly decline in GDP to that extent. So we're in the worst economic environment, let's say ever. And you would think that that would bring on the greatest distress ever. It may not happen because of the Fed and government action. I think we'll still have a very substantial distress episode. In 90, 91 and in 01, 02, we had 2 years of 10% defaults in the high yield bond universe. We may have 20% defaults in high yield bonds anyway. And there are still lots of highly levered companies and highly levered investment entities that desperately need large amounts of cash to avoid a meltdown. And, some of them will not get what they need and some will melt down.
Howard, we know now that the federal bailouts and the stimulus programs that followed the financial crisis came at a social cost. One of those costs was the widening gap between the rich and the poor. You and I have talked about it, you've written about it. What do you think the costs of the pandemic bailouts and stimulus programs will be at a social level?
Well, more of the same. I mean, we've had a substantial rise in populism in this country and around the world. And I would describe populism as class resentment. And the bailout from the global financial crisis was easy to characterize as a bailout of Wall Street, not Main Street. The banks were protected and brought back to life at the same time that many thousands of Americans lost their homes, to put it in stark terms. And so that gave rise to populism and a class resentment. And I think that in this go around, number one, the banks are not in the condition they were 12 years ago, and so they do not have to be buttressed in the same way. And I think it's absolutely essential, as I mentioned before, that this economic support be engaged in. But still, people will be able to say, look, they gave $50 billion to the airlines, and they gave this to that company and this to that company, and they bailed out the fat cats, and 20, 30 million Americans lost their jobs.